We are here in Washington, D.C. Good afternoon or evening, where many people in the audience may be. I'm Jim Feinerman. I'm the professor of Asian Legal Studies here at Georgetown, and also the faculty chair of our Denny Center for Democratic Capitalism. Until 2020, I had also served for 7 years as the Associate Dean for International and Graduate Programs. So I'm very familiar with the offerings that we have at Georgetown and with the many students and alumni that we've had go through our program. My main job here today is to welcome you and also to introduce the people who will be speaking to you, as well as two people who have been very influential and helpful in putting this program together. I first want to recognize Karen Voland, who's the Assistant Dean for Graduate Admissions at the Law Center. Karen has worn many hats during her time at Georgetown, but we're very lucky to have her back in the Graduate Admissions Office, where she's done yeoman's work, especially during the recent pandemic. And we're very glad that she could be here today, although she probably won't be contributing to the conversation that we're having. I wanted to recognize her efforts in getting you all to this point. Also, my colleague Tom Kellogg, who is the executive director of our Center for Asian Law. Tom is a very experienced both practitioner and an expert in, among other things, human rights law. Before coming to Georgetown several years ago, he had spent almost a decade with the Open Society Foundations, working on many things related to Asia and China in the legal realm. He also had previously worked at the Center for Asian and Chinese Law at Yale Law School. Tom is a graduate of Harvard Law School, where he also began studying and working in the area of Chinese and Asian legal studies. But the main event today will be our three speakers, and I want to introduce them in alphabetical order. Slight is intended in the way in which I introduce them, but starting with Anupam Chander, who is a professor here at Georgetown and an expert in the global regulation of new technology. He came to us just a few years ago after being the Martin Luther King professor at the University of California, Davis Law School. And we're very fortunate to have him on our faculty and enjoy the contributions he's made over many decades to the study of both international and new technology. I had the privilege actually of meeting Anupam some years ago when we were both at a conference at Duke. And I learned then of his many interests and talents, and I was very glad that we were able to lure him and his spouse Madhavi Sundar here to Georgetown. Next, we'll hear from Lawrence Gostin. Larry is a university professor, the highest honor that Georgetown awards in any of the faculties in the entire university to a very select few of people who are recognized both nationally and internationally as experts in their field. Larry is also the director of our O'Neill Center for Global Public Health. And this is an area where he has decades of work and experience and also a great deal of academic expertise. Because of his many hats, he's also a professor of medicine at Georgetown University's Medical School and a professor of public health at Johns Hopkins University. And he has been responsible for bringing and ramping up a joint degree program that we have with the Johns Hopkins School of Public Health for JD students who want to do a joint degree in law and public health. And last but certainly not least, I'm glad to introduce Jennifer Hillman. We were law school contemporaries many years ago, and she is a professor of practice, recently returned to us from a short stint at the Carnegie Institution, where she will, in the Council on Foreign Relations rather, where she was specializing in the issues related to global trade. She has many decades of experience in this area. Her most recent stint in government service was as a member of the WTO appellate body, the body that hears all appeals from the decisions of the dispute settlement units in the WTO. Before that, she had a 9-year career on the United States International Trade Commission, and she was also general counsel to the U.S. Trade Representative. So she brings decades of experience and work in the global trade area. And so as you can see, our three faculty experts today, each of them has a contribution to make regarding the topics of today's introduction. And we hope that as we welcome you as newly admitted students to Georgetown, those of you in the audience who are, that you'll get this first taste of the rich banquet of academic expertise that we present and that you will be able to enjoy once you come to Georgetown. So without further ado, let me introduce Professor Chander and have him begin his presentation.
Good morning or good evening to all of you, wherever you are across the world, or good afternoon as well. So a year ago, almost to the day, President Donald Trump announced that as far as TikTok is concerned, they would be banned from the United States. A year later, TikTok still survives. President Trump is long gone from the public scene. Now, what happened? What explains the TikTok ban, and what should we learn from this episode? That's what I'm going to try to explain in the next 5 minutes. So it's a lot to try to cover. So a year ago, as I said, TikTok was purportedly banned by the president. He gave various deadlines, 45 days, 90 days for it to be accomplished. And those deadlines were routinely kind of pushed back as that divestment that was ordered seemed more and more difficult to obtain. Most importantly, it marked a reversal of the United States' position about the global internet. A long time ago, a decade ago, Secretary Hillary Clinton had declared in 2010 the freedom to connect as one of the key kind of human rights of individuals across the world. So she placed the United States alongside the kind of champions of free flow of information across the internet. And this was, of course, in stark opposition to the Chinese approach to the internet. China had pioneered in the 1990s the Golden Shield, building in firewalls, protecting the Chinese internet and insulating it from the global internet. This made it possible for the Chinese government to declare apps unwelcome and to stop foreign information from coming in. So the TikTok ban was, in that sense, the United States borrowing from the Chinese internet governance playbook. And in that sense, I think, remarkably misguided. So what then happened? So I'm going to share a little slide. To show you the judicial response. So as I noted, a year ago, Trump declares a ban. There are 2 executive orders issued. And the first challenge actually comes in a case involving WeChat. So alongside TikTok, he first mentioned TikTok was banned. The orders actually expanded it to include WeChat. And I think this was WeChat's unfortunate kind of happenstance to be a prominent Chinese social media company that was also operating in the United States. WeChat users challenged the ban, and Judge Laurel Beeler, in a weekend decision in the Northern District of California, here's the government's arguments, here's the challenge by WeChat users in California, and says the government hasn't made its case to require this communications platform to be removed from the United States. A couple weeks later, 10 days later, less than 10 days later, the DC District Court enjoined the order in a case brought by TikTok. In this case, the government presented its secret evidence to Judge Carl Nichols. Judge Nichols was a Trump appointee to the federal bench. He was a member of the Federal Society. I suspect that when the government lawyers heard that they were getting Judge Nichols, they were excited about that prospect, but they would be sadly disappointed because he too said the TikTok ban could not stand. The government had not made its case that this communications platform should be banned thus far. He didn't say it was impossible. These were preliminary injunctions, but in both cases now, the courts said the government hadn't made its case. The most fascinating one of these cases is a case coming out of Pennsylvania. Here, two TikTok influencers brought a case against the TikTok ban, saying our livelihoods will be harmed, and our ability to communicate with our public will be harmed by this ban. And here again, the federal judge said, yeah, the government hasn't made its case for why TikTok should be banned. And these three orders stopped the government's attempt to ban TikTok. Now, I think that was the right thing to do. Why? Because there were the TikTok ban was a very political ban. TikTok was the one popular social media platform in the United States that Trump and his supporters could not live without. Could live without, because they could not live without Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter. So we could not imagine Trump banning Facebook because he would have hampered his own cause. But TikTok had become a source of endless anxiety and trouble for President Trump as teens and K-pop stans used the platform to ridicule and humiliate the president. So this was an ideal social media channel to target for political reasons for the president. In 2021, what we see is President Biden reversing the orders, saying instead that the Commerce Department should carefully review foreign apps to make sure that they were in fact safe. But this wasn't targeted to any particular app, but a kind of large principled basis for considering foreign apps. And so that's the Biden administration has reversed the TikTok ban, allowed us to communicate on TikTok, and I think properly asked instead for the Commerce Department to ensure that apps were in fact safe and that they were secure as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Anupam. And going next in alphabetical order is Professor Lawrence Gostin, who's already been introduced. And he's going to speak, I know, about some of the crucial issues that have dominated our consideration for the last year and a half in the realm of global public health. Larry.
Thanks, Jim, and thanks, Anupam. I'm really glad that I actually don't follow TikTok very much, but WeChat is my go-to app whenever I talk to any of my friends in China, and I do all the time. So I don't know what I would have done, and also use it to call my wife. So I'm talking about another aspect of China that that's played out during this pandemic, but it's also predates the pandemic because fairly recently, Tedros, head of the World Health Organization, did something very unusual for him. He's a supreme diplomat. He was the foreign minister of Ethiopia, but he called China out for its failure to cooperate in the SARS-CoV-2 origins investigation. And the last time I can ever think in more than 30 years of working with WHO, a director general calling out a specific country, it was also China. And it was during the SARS outbreaks, where Gro Brundtland, fantastic director general, who had been the prime minister of Norway, so she had a lot of heft herself, called China out for failure to cooperate. And even since then, China has not shared pathogen samples with H7 and other novel influenzas. So this isn't new to us, but it's probably new to many in the public, and even in the government, probably, about how China has behaved on the world stage. But China is an enigma. I'm not a China basher. I think there are incredible qualities in the people of China, and one has to give credit where it's due that China was among the best performers, if not the best performer, in responding to the coronavirus pandemic. But it also has been a highly uncooperative global actor. And so right at the beginning of the pandemic, there's the international health regulations requires countries to report within 24 hours of a novel outbreak, which is defined in Annex 4 of the International Health Regulations. All coronaviruses or SARS-like viruses are automatically reportable. And China failed to report it. Most people say China was late to report it. Actually, they failed to report it. The World Health Organization had picked up the outbreak through its own informal sources within China. And it was only the 2005 reform of the IHR after SARS that allowed WHO to bypass official reports. But having found the unofficial report of the outbreak, they went back to China. China had to confirm it, but they took a long time to do that. Thereafter, China claimed for several weeks that it was not highly transmissible human to human, which was patently untrue because there was enormous community spread, including among health workers and proximate to the Wuhan market. And so you see a very substantial lack of compliance with the international health regulations by the Chinese government. Nonetheless, Tedros praised China publicly, as did Donald Trump at the time. Fast forward, and then we saw a kind of a very unseemly political dispute between the two great superpowers, with the World Health Organization caught in the middle, and President Trump saying that WHO was in China's pocket. That was not true. What was happening was, as Tedros was playing a hardball game with Xi Jinping inside and outside, he was complimenting him. President Trump was calling it the Wuhan virus, which is very much against the protocol of global health governance because it stigmatizes cultures and people, and there's been a lot of Asian American and Asian violence and distrust here in America and in other Western countries, which I think is an unforgivable part of the ugly part of a pandemic, truly. And in the middle of all that, President Trump formally sent a letter to the Secretary General of the United Nations, announced giving 1 year's notice of our withdrawal from the organization, and he also withdrew funds illegally. Strangely enough, we talked about TikTok, the O'Neill Institute and with me as a named party we're planning with Harold Koh from Yale to bring litigation against the Trump administration for withdrawing, because our livelihood was at stake because we're a WHO collaborating center. So we already had pro bono lawyers, a high shoe law firm, and we were going to do that. The big controversy now, of course, is around the origins of SARS-CoV-2. That's important because, we first of all, the world deserves to know, because the world has suffered immeasurably, more than any time since the World War II and the great influenza pandemic of 1918. And so we deserve to know how it started, but also it's necessary for us to be able to prevent future outbreaks. There are two prevailing theories. One theory is by far the most probable, which is a naturally occurring zoonotic spillover from an animal to a human. We think probably a bat through an intermediary animal. And I think the best hypothesis now is that intermediary animal was in the Wuhan wet market, because they had civet cats and other exotic animals that were known to carry coronaviruses. The other theory is a lab leak from the Wuhan Institute of Virology. That can't be ruled out, but most of us in the field don't think it's highly probable. But we do think it needs to be investigated, because there have been lab leaks, and there was coronavirus research going on, although Republicans in Congress saying that it was gain of function research is wrong. Dr. Fauci is absolutely correct that it was not a gain of function research, and he should know. He's the one who made the award. So we're kind of at an impasse now, because there was one WHO investigation into the origins about 6 to 8 months ago. And it did involve a very brief tour of the Wuhan Institute of Virology and some at the wet market. But it's been roundly criticized. China had to approve all of the members of the International Expert Committee assembled by WHO. That committee didn't have access to information and sources. I kind of view its tour of the Wuhan Institute of Virology as almost like a Disneyland tour, and clearly insufficient. When the report came back, Tedros criticized it, said it wasn't rigorous. They shouldn't have ruled out the lab leak. Fast forward, President Biden is now ordered the national intelligence agencies to come up within 90 days of a report using covert sources about which is the most likely of the two theories. That is ongoing. At the same time, very recently, within the last week or so, Tedros has called on China to allow a second investigation with independent terms and rigor. Very predictably, China said no. And so, we're at an impasse, essentially, whereby the world needs to know this, particularly the Western world, Europe, the free world in Asia, and in the Americas, have called on China to allow a second investigation. That was never going to happen. Knowing China over 10 years, well, more than 10, 20 years since SARS, knowing how it's behaved during the coronavirus pandemic, it was not going to allow it. I'll leave you with one last question, which the South China Morning Press asked me, which I thought was a really intriguing question. the South China Morning Press, of course, would like China to investigate the Wuhan Institute of Virology, which is, a level 4 biosecurity lab in China. And so they said, well, suppose that the outbreak for this pandemic began in Atlanta. It's not fanciful. It could have happened. In fact, the last pandemic, H1N1, started in the United States. And they said, would the United States allow a foreign international group of experts into the high-level CDC security lab? I mean, I've been in it, but only under extraordinary precautions and security. And I reflected on that, and I said, I'd like to know what your thinking would be. My answer would be no, they wouldn't. But what would be very different is that, to me, it would be unthinkable that the United States wouldn't have a fully rigorous, accountable, and transparent investigation itself that could be trusted. China would never have done that and isn't doing that. And I think that's the difference between a free democracy and an authoritarian system. And it also reminds us, as Anupam said, that we have to watch that we don't play by China's playbook. We need to follow our own rules of vibrant freedoms and democracy, and we do sometimes, and maybe more often than we'd like, slip back in so many different ways. So we have to protect our democracy. It's a very fragile one. So I'll leave you with that, and lovely to be with you, Jim. Thank you for inviting me, and Karen, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Larry. And before I go on, I just want to reflect on two things that have been raised by our two previous speakers. One is the treatment that the United States government afforded TikTok, which shows the sort of two sides with regard to how these rules might play out in international trade and commerce. On the one hand, the Trump administration was quite willing to impose a ban and take extraordinary steps that seem to violate our free market principles. But after the election in 2020 and with the ascendancy of President Biden, we seem to have reverted to more free market principles, which is something that is allowed in a democratic system. And to take Professor Gostin's point, I think it's also worth noting that while we sometimes keep our cards close to the vest with regard to sensitive issues, there's also an ability of ordinary citizens and non-governmental organizations to use the legal system to obtain information through Freedom of Information Act requests and similar stratagems, which seem to be sadly lacking not only in China, but in many other political regimes around the world. But I don't want to delay welcoming Professor Jennifer Hillman to speak. And I would just note that we're taking questions in the Q&A at the bottom of your screen. And if you have them, please submit them, especially for Professor Hillman, who has a hard stop at the top of the hour and will have to leave us then. So if you have questions particularly directed to her and her presentation, please put them in early. And of course, we welcome questions for any of our other presenters, or for that matter, for me, for Karen Boland, or Tom Kellogg. So Jennifer, without delay.
Perfect. Thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be here. So good morning and good afternoon and good evening to all of you. We're going to shift a little bit, I think, in this presentation from the sort of technology and global health issues that you've been hearing about to the international economic realm. And for me, there's been so much happening across that's almost hard to know where to start. But I thought I'd use these opening comments to focus on sort of 5 features of the ongoing trade and economic battle between the United States and China, all of which represent both bilateral concerns and challenges to the global rules-based trading system. I'm doing that in the hope that this is going to stimulate our discussion and get our admitted students excited about the prospect of what lies ahead, because you have certainly come to the right place at the right time to learn about and really to help shape the future of the international economic order. I'm really proud that Georgetown has, I would say, the broadest and deepest curriculum in this space of any law school in the country, and has an excellent international economic law institute that sort of provides a lot of activities and speakers and programming around these international economic issues. So I'm going to touch on 5 things that I think are at least developments worth following. I'm going to start with, if you will, the biggest trade dispute, biggest trade war, if you want to call it that, in the world between China and the United States. There's no question that the tensions, the trade tensions, had been growing for many, many years. The U.S. had been raising concerns over everything from protection of intellectual property to technology transfers to concerns over China's industrial policies, the amount of state-owned enterprises, state subsidies, concerns over gross overcapacity in many of the industries that was resulting in sort of China flooding the markets around the world with excess amounts of steel and aluminum and chemicals and many other things. I mean, this led, among other things, the Trump administration's United States Trade Representative to say, it was a mistake for the United States and the world to have allowed China to join the WTO, the World Trade Organization, when it did in 2001. Now, I don't agree with that, but I do believe that the United States and the rest of the world did not use the trade tools that were available to it under the WTO and under U.S. domestic law sort of often enough or early enough. And what we did see was some increased activity by the United States in the trade remedy area, some activity in terms of a number of challenges at the WTO, but again, a handful of them of challenges to what China was doing. And lastly, what we've seen recently is, in essence, a totally unilateral action by the United States under domestic U.S. law, Section 301, to impose tariffs on China after a finding that China had been engaging in this, again, in this theft of intellectual property and forced technology transfers that resulted over a series of steps in, tariffs putting on nearly $360 billion worth of Chinese imports, and China very understandably reacting to that by imposing its own retaliatory tariffs on the United States. So we have the two, clearly engaging in, if you put tariffs on me, I put tariffs on you, I put more tariffs, you put more tariffs. We've seen this now, such that we've now then resulted in January of 2020, a so-called phase 1 deal between the United States and China, in which, again, China made a number of commitments to change some of its IP rules, to change its access for financial services companies going into China, to change some standards around agriculture trade, and most importantly, perhaps, made a commitment that it would buy $200 billion more goods from the United States than it had been buying previously. What's become clear over time is that phase 1 deal has had a couple of responses. I mean, one, the rest of the world says, hey, wait a minute, if you're saying, China, you must buy $200 billion more of US goods, it's in essence saying to the rest of the world, that means China's buying $200 billion less from Brazil or Europe or Japan or others. So you've seen, a response from the rest of the world. And you've also seen at some level this deal fail to come into real fruition. I mean, we're now 1.5 years into this 2-year commitment by China, and yet the Chinese buying is at best going to hit sort of 60 or 65% of the goal. So again, this is one of the things that's on the table. So far, the Biden administration has left all of these tariffs in place. China has left all of its tariffs in place. But it's clear that the Biden administration is now really working very intensely to develop a new U.S. China trade policy. So that's one of those ones of stay tuned. The second real development that we've seen in this space has been the increasing role of export controls and controls on foreign direct investment coming into the United States. And for me, this is one of these interesting developments to watch. You used to feel as though there was a clear dividing line between national security interests and economic security interests. And the national security folks had their sets of regimes and their controls and their processes. And over here, you had all of the trade and the economic processes, and there was a clear line between them. There's no question that the Trump administration, in terms of the way it's thought about these tariffs and developments generally, particularly in the technology and cybersecurity space, we've erased that line. And so now you have this complete blending of national security and economic security concerns, which have ended up in the United States getting played out by an increasing use of export controls to say, oh, wait a minute, that technology, yes, it has a commercial operation, but it could also be used for military purposes. It could also be used to guide missile systems or to do something. So we control the export of that technology. You saw it happen as a response to the COVID pandemic, where countries started saying, oh, wait a minute, I want to keep all of the vaccines or all of the medicines or all of the PPE in my country. I'm going to put export controls and not allow it to be exported out into the rest of the world. You've seen an increasing number of countries increase their scrutiny over foreign direct investment. What can China invest in the United States? If their investment is going to result in technology being transferred back to China, maybe we should stop those investments. So you've again seen in that space, this increasing use of export controls and restraints on investment. The third development that I've been following really closely, that's one that I think is got a lot of interest in terms of how we want to think about it, is what should be the response of the world to China's Belt and Road Initiative. And as many of you may know, I mean, this is the largest infrastructure investment program ever, far, far outpacing the Marshall Plan that the United States and others engaged in following World War II. It is building and has built roads, railroads, ports, electricity grids, power plants, sort of all over the developing world. And it's very clear that when China started out this initiative, they were filling a tremendous need, particularly among many of their neighbors, but in general among the developing world that really needed power, water, again, basic transportation infrastructure. And China was the one stepping up, and the rest of the world and the United States and others had sort of moved away from doing a lot of that hard and expensive investment in basic infrastructure. But what we've learned as this Belt and Road Initiative has gone on, and it has expanded massively. It is not just around China's neighbors. It is now a global enterprise with a lot of Belt and Road Initiative projects in Latin America, all across Africa, all across Europe, all across Southeast Asia, is that the way in which China has gone about Belt and Road has created a lot of risks for the United States and for the rest of the world. Macroeconomic risks, because the amount of debt that is being incurred by a lot of countries that are already suffering from significant debt problems is going to create huge debt sustainability issues and potentially destabilize a lot of our sort of macroeconomics. Secondly, it's put a huge pressure on the amount of subsidized, privileged market access entry for Chinese companies. So it's made it much harder for U.S. companies and the rest of the world to compete in any of the markets in which this Belt and Road Initiative has given these Chinese companies access to markets on the back of a lot of subsidies coming out of China that has effectively sort of frozen out a lot of the rest of the world. It's enabled a lot of China to lock countries into kind of China's sort of ecosystem, particularly in the technology space. And again, starting to create some real concerns about whether or not the systems that are being put in place are going to be interoperable with anybody else's, or whether once you've committed, if you will, to this Chinese technology, whether that's in the 5G space or in artificial intelligence or others, whether you can plug and play in, if you will, other components or other technologies, or whether we are literally creating two divergent sort of technology paths, particularly in the telecommunication space, that aren't going to talk to each other. Fourthly, I think it's been very clear when we've looked at what's the way in which the lending has occurred for all of these BRI projects, that it's making it a lot harder for the World Bank and others that have high standards for lending, that you have to do an environmental impact assessment first, that you have to do an assessment of the overall sustainability of these projects, that's not happening. And so it's making it harder to create high standards. And lastly, the concern is that this is making it much harder to fight climate change, because one of the major things that China has exported along the Belton Road is coal-fired power plants. Over 260 of them being exported, some of them even literally dismantling a coal-fired plant in China and picking it up and moving it across the border to Cambodia. But it's making it much harder. It's making these countries reliant on coal-fired power for probably 30, 35, 40 years, the life of these plants. So again, a concern there. So how the world and the United States respond to Belton Road is another one of those issues to sort of stay tuned to. The fourth one I'm going to touch on just really quickly is the rise of subsidies. I mean, part of what drove a lot of the United States and others' concerns about China is the degree to which China operates in a very different system. I mean, this gets into this whole debate about whether or not the international economic order is centered around market economy principles or not. And there was a big debate that happened last September over, could we agree on the fundamental principles of the World Trade Organization and the international rules-based system? Could we agree on what the basic principles were? And there was agreement on a lot of things. It should be transparent, it should be rules-based, it should, etc. But when it came to this issue of it should be based on market economy principles, China said no. No, we do not agree that that is one of the founding principles of the sort of economic system. And what you've seen in China is a significant growth in the number of state-owned enterprises, a significant merging within China of those state-owned enterprises so that they become bigger and bigger and bigger sort of within China and convey a tremendous amount of power. And at the same time, in the United States and in the rest of the world and among the G7 countries, you are seeing this idea of build back better, build back the world better, which means the United States and the rest of the world are going to start their own subsidies very significantly, both to build back the United States to respond to COVID. There is going to need to be a lot more subsidies in the developed world. To respond to climate change, there are going to have to be a lot more subsidies in the developed world. So we're going to see a big debate and dispute over over that issue. And the last one that I'm going to touch on is the rise of regionalism. Yes, we have the World Trade Organization there. Yes, we have global-based rules, and we probably need global rules in a number of areas. But the last 10 years, there's no question that what you have seen is the rise of regional trading blocks and regional systems. The biggest one, obviously, in Asia, where a tremendous amount of the trade that occurs in Asia is intra-Asian trade. And you've seen the two biggest trade agreements in the last decade get formed in Asia. What used to be the Trans-Pacific Partnership is now the CPTPP, covers 40% of the world's population, 40% of the GDP of the world are among the countries that are in that CPTPP. And just last year, you saw the creation of the Regional Cooperative Economic Partnership, China, Japan, Korea, Australia, New Zealand, and all of the ASEAN countries, the Southeast Asian countries, getting together in this global compact. And you see now, a sort of a complete change in the sense that this is caused a little bit by the failure of the WTO to reach new agreements, but all of the push is now towards much more regional trade agreements. And you see that in these sort of cutbacks in the amount of ideas around decoupling, about supply chain resilience, about bringing production home. You are seeing much more of a pushback on regional agreements. Where is this all headed? I think fundamentally what you're seeing is a big shift in the Biden administration to working with allies. Now, exactly what working with allies means and where it will take us, I think remains one of those things sort of to be watched for. But I think it's very clear that across the entire international economic space, a real paradigm shift is occurring around all 5 of these issues that I talked about. And so I think we're going to see a bit of a new international economic order emerging in the next 4 or 5 years. I'm just really thrilled for all of you that you get to be in the front row and part of the effort to sort of think about, study about, research about, write about and be engaged in this whole effort to reshape our international economic order. So thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer. And in the interest of getting questions in before Jennifer, and I now know that Professor Gostin as well may have to leave us before the 9:30 stop for this program. So if you have questions addressed to either of them, please put them in the queue now. I'm going to combine two questions for Professor Hillman that came in. One from the Washington, D.C. chief correspondent for the China Daily, Chen Weihua, and the other from Kelsey Harrison, that relate to how to deal with trade disputes with China. The first question was, how is the right way for the Biden administration to deal with China in trade disputes? Better through the WTO, but given its weakened state, is it going to be necessary to continue with a more bilateral approach? And from Chen Weihua, the question about the bright side of the Belt and Road Initiative, because it's building infrastructure in places like Africa and Latin America that are badly needed, and that the idea that this has created a debt trap for the recipient countries, Chen Weihua argues, has been disproved by scholars at Johns Hopkins. So two questions somewhat related to Professor Hillman.
Okay, let me take the first one, the second one first. Has the Belt and Road created a debt trap? I think the answer is no, it has not. If you mean by a debt trap, that China has purposefully gone in and engaged in a project where the collateral for that project is ownership or Chinese rights to the property, the real property of that country, and that as a result, when there is a default on the loan, China then gets to own or control, significant amounts of a given country. If that's what you mean by defining a debt trap, I would say no. The Belt and Road has not been designed to do that. If, on the other hand, the question is more, is this creating long-term, again, macroeconomic potential instability and huge debt burdens on these countries that will be very hard for them to get out of? The answer is yes. And we know a lot more, again, through the great work of one of our own Georgetown colleagues, Anna Gelpern. I would highly recommend for those that are interested in it to look at the study that she and her colleagues did, where they examined the exact loan terms of 100 of the major loans made under the Belt and Road Initiative. And what they found was some very unusual provisions in them. First, absolute requirement for secrecy. So again, all of these loans are between China and one other entity, and nobody is allowed to know anything about it. So the fact that they could even get their hands on these 100 loans to study is in and of itself, took a huge amount of effort. Secondly, all of these loans have a requirement that you cannot go to the Paris Club, which is, again, this group of international countries and finance ministers that help a country when they have to renegotiate a loan. In order to do that on terms that are going to be fair all the way around, again, it's common to go through this Paris Club of countries, and each of these loans has an absolute prohibition on using anything like a Paris Club kind of a renegotiation. There's unusual cross-default swaps in them, and many of these loans require these countries to set up a separate offshore bank account that in essence allows China to be first in line to be paid if there is a default on that loan. So the bottom line of that is, for many of these projects that are not financially sustainable, or certainly will not get a return on the investment for decades, it is miring these countries in this very hard to sustain debt. And when China has been asked to renegotiate the debt, what China is not doing largely is writing off the debt or reducing the ultimate amount. Largely what happens in the renegotiations is China just stretches out the time frame for the payments, but the countries are still on the hook for all of that debt. And again, this debt is largely issued not as a grant or as a concessional loan or as a development push to these countries. These are straight commercial contracts at straight commercial loan rates. So in that sense, it is creating a debt overhang, again, across these countries. On the second question, or the first question, if you will, of how should we better resolve our trade disputes with China, I guess my answer is all of the above. I think, again, the United States and others needs to both use our own domestic tools. That means our anti-dumping rules, our countervailing duty rules, and our safeguard rules as appropriate. In other words, those are laws that are on the books that are appropriate and that require the United States to engage in a factual investigation where you first determine that that action is justified. At the WTO, the problem is the demise of the appellate body. So again, I still say the WTO panels are up and running. The WTO dispute settlement system up through the panel stage is still there and is still the best mechanism for resolving disputes. The problem has been because the United States has blocked the appointment of appellate body members. When you get to the appeal stage, there is no appellate body to hear it. And the concern is at the end of the day, what will happen is if a country doesn't like the outcome. So say the United States wins the dispute against China. China has the option of filing an appeal. And because there is no appellate body member sitting, the United States, in theory, cannot ask China to comply or to do anything while the appeal is pending. And with no appellate body member sitting, the appeal could pen forever. So again, the concern is that that dispute settlement mechanism needs to get back on track in order to provide a good forum in which not just the United States, but the rest of the world have a forum in which to resolve their disputes with China.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. I have a question for Professor Gostin, and then if she's still on, one more question for Professor Hillman. I'll state them both now, but ask Professor Gostin to answer first. The question for Professor Gostin came from the audience over email. It says, China has taken some key steps on vaccine diplomacy, reaching out to a number of different countries with donated vaccines. Is there more that Washington can do on this front? And Professor Hillman, this last question, if there's time, is from Keiichi Nakamura about with US perspectives, can we expect Japan to play a role under the Biden administration in the US-China trade war?
Did you want me to go first, Jim?
You can go first, Larry, yes.
Jennifer, go first. Okay, Jennifer did talk about the Belton Road Initiative, which I followed quite a lot because a lot of the Belton Road is ostensibly thought of as a health infrastructure kind of idea, and China's view of global health assistance is very different from the Western view. I mean, both are self-interested, of course, but China's is very mercantile, very transactional, and it's been that way with the vaccine donations. So I have a couple of worries with China's vaccine donation policy, even though it's better than hoarding the vaccines, which is what the US and Europe have done. But basically, the first problem is that there is not a lot of transparency about the safety and efficacy of the two major Chinese vaccines. Both have got WHO emergency use listing, but many of us worry that it's really not holding up robustly, particularly against key variants like the Delta variant. But the second is that China has used its vaccine diplomacy as leverage, in some cases, making someone not recognize Taiwan, or to get some geostrategic advantage in the South China Sea, or to gain certain assets or minerals from Africa. So I don't think vaccine should ever be used for, with that purpose. And it's interesting when Biden announced first 500 million and then 1 billion doses of the vaccine, he pointedly said, and we won't expect favors in return. I mean, he didn't mention China, but he was clearly looking at Xi Jinping. As to what the United States could do, I could send you a link in the chat. Matt Havey, who Anupam knows fairly well, and I and Matt Kavanaugh wrote a recent article in the Journal of the American Medical Association setting out the steps the US leadership, could take to reassert vaccine leadership. So I will send that link.
Thank you very much, Larry. And Jennifer, if we still have you.
Yeah, thank you for the question. A huge role for Japan, and two ones that I'll point out that are already sort of in train is that, beginning in 2017, the United States, the European Union, and Japan have been working in what is referred to as the Trilateral Cooperative to try to develop new rules on how to discipline subsidies. And they've made a lot of progress in trying to come up with these new rules. And Japan has clearly played a huge leadership role in that space of trying to find this mix that would then ultimately be brought into the WTO. The second one is, to the extent that the Biden administration has started to formulate some of its response to the Belt and Road and provide actual infrastructure, because again, there's an acknowledgement that that's the issue. The Biden administration started with the so-called Quad, which is Australia, India, Japan, and the United States. So it is very clear that within that Quad in the Indo-Pacific, to think about both security issues and the development of infrastructure to offer an alternative to countries that may want an alternative to the Belt and Road. That's largely going to be done in huge measure as a result of Chinese leadership. And the last thing I will say, Japanese leadership. The last thing I'll say on the Japan front is, when you think about it, when the Trump administration decided that it would not go forward with the Trans-Pacific Partnership, many in the United States assumed that meant the end of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Instead, what happened is Japan stepped up in a huge leadership role to say, no, we're going to go ahead with the Trans-Pacific Partnership without the United States. And it was Japan that led that effort to make what is now the CPTPP come into fruition. It was Japan's leadership there. And I would say Japan is continuing to play an incredibly important leadership role at the WTO in many of the debates and the discussions on all of the issues that I touched on.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. I know that you have to leave us at this point because it is 9 o'clock. But your contributions have been very valuable, and I know that students who are coming to Georgetown will look forward to having opportunities to take classes with you and also to hear you speak at various events that we have at the Law Center about international trade.
Thank you. And welcome to all of the admitted students. We are so looking forward to having you. A lot is going on, and we're excited to have you with us.
And a couple of questions have come in that I think are probably addressed to Professor Chander. One is a question from Junya Nagasawa about China's development of digital currency, which they say may soon prevail. How will digital currency affect the US and China relationships? And how should the US deal with the prevalence of a Chinese created digital currency?
So I think it's a great question. And I think we have yet to see what it all means. We're still trying to get our head around what digital currencies mean for geopolitics. What we are seeing is that governments across the world are seeing China issuing a digital yuan and saying, we need to do the same. And so we've seen corporations offer digital currencies. So Facebook planning its Libra coin. And obviously we've seen digital currencies in the form of Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies. Digital currencies offered by the state, however, are very different. They are much more regulable. They are controlled by the state from the get-go. And so digital currency raises questions. So when you exchange cash, it's typically untraceable. Digital currencies may actually prove a lot more traceable and therefore have the kind of character of possibly building surveillance right in to the financial transactions network. Of course, financial transactions are, know your customer rules, et cetera, are prominent part of financial transaction system rules as it currently stands. So we've got those concerns in the United States as well as in China. So this is a shared concern about these things. But in terms of how the US should respond, I think what we're going to see is the United States saying, well, maybe we want to have something similar. And I think you see the Fed mooting these kinds of possibilities. And it's not so much that the Chinese yuan represents a threat to the United States. I don't find that's the case, but it may feel that it may remind other countries that we need to make sure that our systems are best prepared for the 21st century and follow China's lead in this context.
Thank you for that. There's another question for you, Anupam, that came over email. We're just a week away from the Biden administration calling out China over the Microsoft hack. The Biden administration is trying to rally key allies to create a united front on cyber hacking by China, but has avoided sanctions, at least at this stage. Will this strategy work? And are there other measures that the United States could take?
So you've seen lots of different efforts by the Obama administration, the Trump administration, and now the Biden administration to address Chinese hacking. This has been a persistent problem, and there's not an easy solution to this problem. It's, you are seeing this kind of, activity across the world. So you saw, you've seen prosecutions of PLA soldiers, in the United States, et cetera. And so, it's hard. None of that has succeeded. And so it's hard to know how to respond in a way that guarantees success. The Biden administration has decided this is not going to be a bilateral problem. This is going to be a multilateral problem. And I think that's the key to understanding how the Biden administration's approach differs from the Trump administration's approach. The Biden administration has said, let us join with the rest of the world in challenging some of these practices by China. I think relying upon the fact that kind of global condemnation of these practices is likely to be more successful and cause the Chinese government to reconsider. And I think that is promising. I think that is an appropriate approach. Of course, we've seen in the West, I want to call out Western countries as well. The NSO hacking leak is devastating. You don't need to use TikTok to exfiltrate data if you can just target the particular phones of the particular leaders or journalists that are your biggest irritants, using tools supplied by an Israeli company, and just pay the $1 million that it's asking for those kind of hacking tools, so you can hack all the journalists who you feel are treating you unfairly. So this is a problem across the world. The Biden administration has addressed this in a multilateral way. I also wish the Biden administration would more forcefully denounce these Western surveillance for hire spyware companies and put pressure on their governments to stop these kinds of sales.
Well, thank you very much for that. I would encourage people who have other questions to submit them now, since we're sort of at the end of the queue. Although I do want to make one correction. I took the former title of Chen-Wei Hua, who's been contributing to the chat here. He was the DC U.S. correspondent, but he is now the EU correspondent for the China Daily.
The question is whether or not Chen-Wei Hua thinks that's a promotion or a demotion.
Jim, can I jump in with
Please, Tom.
just a quick comment on Chen-Wei Hua's two earlier, obviously very excellent and on point questions. One is to say, I think a lot of us here in Washington hope that the Biden administration's approach of both finding areas of common ground, including on public health, as Professor Gostin spoke about, and on issues, obviously crucial issues like climate change, while being candid about areas of tension, that could work. Obviously, the initial results coming out of the meeting with the Deputy Secretary of State just a few days ago are not particularly promising, but we are going to have continued talks, not at the structural level, as Chen-Wei Hua points out, in terms of restarting some of those massive structures that, let's face it, the US felt weren't really productive. And there was that feeling at the end of the Obama administration, among many here in Washington, to be sure. But, you know, we have an envoy coming from Beijing to Washington, I think, in the next few days. And the hope is that these higher level talks will yield some fruit. I do think that China should take a second look at some of these areas of tension, both with the United States and with other key players in the international community, and try to tweak their policy a little bit. It's no secret that since 2012, when Xi Jinping came to power, that China has taken a more conservative turn on a whole host of international and domestic issues. And so thinking about whether or not the tensions that have emerged as a result of those changes might mean that a rethink is in order, you know, I think that would be helpful in terms of reducing overall tensions. And just quickly on the academic exchange point that Mr. Chen raises, certainly I can say that Georgetown, and Jim, you may want to chime in on this as well, Georgetown is certainly committed to maintaining and even expanding our academic exchanges with our Chinese partners. They've been a little bit in slow motion as a result of COVID, but we are committed to building them back up, both virtually in the weeks and months to come, and over the longer term, very much in person as international travel starts to come back online. So, you know, Mr. Chen is right that there's a problem there, but we're going to do what we can to keep those exchanges going.
Yes, I certainly agree. And I think that one of the things that is an unfortunate development as the world begins to open up again in the post-COVID environment is the United States, and Karen Volan can correct me about this, has become surprisingly open with respect to especially student visas coming to the United States at this point. But it's very difficult for us to send students the other direction. Most of the countries in Asia, either because of the current state of the pandemic there or because of continuing lockdowns, don't make it possible for American students to go in the sort of two-way flow that we had in the pre-pandemic era. And as people may know, we have a number of exchange relationships with universities in China, but also in the rest of the Asia-Pacific region and also in India. But because of the current state of the pandemic in those countries and the policies that the governments have adopted in response, we can't get our students over there, which they would dearly like to do, especially because in the brief 3 years of law school, most of our students, if they do study abroad, can only do so for one semester, and they may miss a window as a result of those restrictions. On the other hand, you know, every sovereign country is free to make the policies that they deem best for protecting the health and safety of their citizens. And I think that also they're looking over their shoulder with the idea that should something befall a foreign student visitor as a result of the pandemic, that could be very bad, both politically and also in terms of the bad reputation that it might give to international academic exchanges going forward. So I can understand their caution. We were very cautious too at the early stages of the pandemic. And I think that one of the benefits of that decision early on to you know, go virtual and provide for virtual education for the past academic year has been that we avoided, you know, maybe worse consequences as a result of the pandemic. I see one more question in the queue, and this is from Chuck Curran that says, given all the other areas of tension, what should the U.S. strategy be to address the encroachments on independent governance in Hong Kong? I don't know if that's addressed to any of us in particular. I know Tom and I would be happy to talk about it, but if Anupam wants to say something, please do.
Go ahead, I'll say something at the end.
Okay. Well, I think that, you know, we're obviously very concerned about Hong Kong, and I'll let Tom talk about the work that he's done in the Center for Asian Law with regard to reports on the circumstances in Hong Kong since the crackdown just over a year ago with the creation of the new national security law there. I personally am very concerned and sad about the situation in Hong Kong that was developing even before the national security law was adopted, and may have been one of the animating features in the creation of the national security law. Hong Kong had descended into chaos starting in 2018, 2019. And it seems that this was the only expedient that the government decided it had in its arsenal to try and quell the unrest. We can debate going into the long-term future whether that was the wisest policy or not. But it did seem that things were spinning out of control in Hong Kong. And this is the path that the both Hong Kong and mainland governments decided to take with regard to clamping down on what was a very disruptive series of demonstrations and chaotic developments in Hong Kong. But Hong Kong is really quite a global treasure and something that has been very important in the modernization over the last several decades of China itself. It was originally the sort of entrepot, the window to the world, when the Chinese economy was much more closed. But at the time that China began to open up in the late 1970s, Hong Kong also became very valuable as a place where back offices could be established for the range of foreign businesses and enterprises, including law firms that wanted to enter into the China market. And as that becomes more and more difficult with the restrictions that are being placed on as a result of these new legislations, and also the fear that certain people who believe that their activities actually were legal and allowable find out that they may have violated aspects of the national security law, it makes it very difficult to maintain that kind of important status for Hong Kong as a place where East and West, where China and the rest of the world can meet. But I'll turn it over to Tom and then for a comment from Anupam.
Yeah, thanks, Jim. And I've put into the chat for those who are interested the two documents that the Center for Asian Law has put out over the past few months on the national security law for those who want to take a deeper dive. I agree with everything that Jim just said in terms of Hong Kong's sort of unique character and the actually vitally important role that it has played as an entreport for businesses going into China, but also for all sorts of new political, legal, and other ideas that have played a vital role in shaping the reform era over the past 40, 50 years in China. And that role has been very beneficial to the Chinese Communist Party as it has sought to take a more flexible approach to law and governance, post 1976. And I think it can continue to play that role in the decades ahead. For U.S. policy, I think what I would say is that the message from the U.S. side to Beijing is that the current approach to Hong Kong is not helpful, that it is becoming a major irritant in terms of the U.S.-China relationship, as well as China's relationship with Europe and other Asian countries, and that it is exacting a huge reputational cost for China in the eyes of different publics around the world, and then a lot of people's views of the Chinese Communist Party are being shaped by the events in Hong Kong. I think the U.S. could argue to Beijing that the right approach right now going forward is to just press pause, to have a de-escalation or sort of metaphorical ceasefire, if you will, to stop arresting individuals under the national security law, to stop tightening up on the political space in other ways with other new laws and other new national security focused regulations, and instead to allow for the sort of a period of sort of settling and de-escalations of tensions, and then to search for ways to restart dialogue with the people of Hong Kong on Hong Kong's political future. I'm not predicting that. I'm not. There's no indication that that would be the approach that the Chinese government would adopt, given their actions in recent months. But in terms of a way to get out of the current crisis, I think that's the message that Washington could carry to China.
And Anupam, before you speak, I just want to mention that a new question has entered the queue addressed to you. So you might address this as well, about the efficacy of the BIS restrictions against selling American origin components to Huawei and its subsidiaries and other blacklisted firms, that this has done damage to the credibility and R&D capacity of the U.S. semiconductor firms, which will be losing out on that business.
Great. So let me address the Hong Kong situation first. So I echo everything that Jim and Tom have said. Hong Kong is this remarkable crossroads between East and West, and China should hit pause on its increasingly strident governance efforts to erode the one country, two systems model that has existed and really just make it one model. And so that promise to keep Hong Kong as this bridge to the rest of the world is being eroded. And I think it's one that it will backfire for the Chinese government, because companies will pull out. You're giving every move in Hong Kong that's suppressing speech is helping Hong Kong's competitors in the world at large to attract capital and to attract businesses. So I think a lot. You've seen businesses start to flee Hong Kong, and so I think that's a real problem. Now, with respect to the semiconductor and chips and all those kinds of export prohibitions questions that Joseph Vaughn asks about, this is a very tricky issue, because what you're seeing is this plays right into the kind of made in China plan. So what you've seen is that technological decoupling forced technological decoupling, which seems to have really kind of given a fillip to the Chinese government's plans to replace foreign technologies with domestic technologies as much as possible. That's very hard to do when it comes to semiconductors. The economies of scale with semiconductors are particularly significant. The technologies that are in place to manufacture the machines and the machines that make the chips, et cetera, are proprietary and hard to duplicate. But what you are going to see is those companies, the Chinese government very much investing in that. And in that sense, may reduce that kind of soft power of American semiconductor manufacturers by disabling this large market from the extra R&D that American companies would have, because they supply a global market as opposed to a market outside China alone. So for me, it's not clear that these chips are so critical for supporting China's military in a particular way. And so I'm not as convinced that they have this. So the question is, what's the price that we're paying if we allow for these exports to continue? And it's not so clear to me that there is a clear military, that if we stop these chips from being exported, the Chinese military therefore ceases to develop its own technologies. So I'd like to be more comfortable that the price we're paying in both economics and technology for these kinds of exclusions, these export constraints, are in fact having that kind of military advantage that we are seeking. So I think these are complicated issues, and others are certainly more expert in the specific technologies than I am. But I think they do raise these questions that, Joseph, you have rightly raised in your question.
And we have one last question from Charles Lonkan that I think relates to things we've already been discussing in the past few minutes about the lack of transparency on the part of the Chinese government where it's most necessary, combined with the influence buying throughout the world with the Belton Road Initiative. And the question of how the United States can confront this if it depends on multilateral cooperation, which may not exist. I'll make a brief remark about that, and then if Anupam or Tom want to chime in, please do. I think that this is a question that has confronted the world numerous times, especially in the post-World War II and the Cold War era. How do we, promote better practices with regard to trade and other forms of international exchange, especially when there seem to be what we would characterize from our perspective as bad actors. The Soviet Union in the immediate post-World War II era, or the characterization that has been made of China more recently, especially in the Xi Jinping era, that we believe that they're not acting in the best interests of the global community, and we want to make sure that they join the fold or remain in the fold. And I think that there are carrots and sticks. The Trump administration seemed to be devoted completely to sticks and no carrots. The Obama administration, at least towards the end, was sort of shifting from a period of what they hoped was going to be valuable cooperation to something that looked like it was more confrontational, but of course, they left office before that could be fully implemented. So I think that the question is maybe how much room there is for global coordination, especially when even United States allies in other areas might have their own interests in trading with China and don't want to cut off a valuable source both of imports and exports for their business.
Can I chime in on that briefly as well, Jim? I think that's all spot on. And just the one sort of thought or two quick thoughts that I would add to that is that one, and if I'm not misreading the question, I think there's a hint of this there, that right now that the US has to go through a period of trying to rebuild trust, that during the Trump years, especially with our, allies in Europe and even many of our longtime friends like South Korea and Japan in Asia, that there was a very significant decline in the credibility of the United States during the Trump years, that whatever one thinks of the Trump phenomenon on the domestic front, it didn't play well internationally, and the US moves to withdraw from international organizations during the Trump years and to question longstanding bilateral diplomatic relationships and to adopt a much more transactional approach to them, really exerted a significant reputational toll on the United States. And there's going to be some time where that needs to be rebuilt. And I think the Biden administration is off to a good start on that front, but it's not something that's going to be accomplished in 6 months or even a year or what have you. It needs to be a long-term process. And then a quick second point on that, which is to say that success on this front and success in terms of the US maintaining a more proactive leadership role will depend on the US maintaining its economic and political strength and resiliency at home. I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that the US political system is in crisis. And we saw that crisis play out in very dramatic form on January 6th. Those of us who live here in Washington, D.C. had a front row seat for that. And the Biden administration is certainly trying to take steps to sort of rebuild some of the basic building blocks of our democracy, but that too is a long-term process, and our ability to project strength and influence internationally will depend in part on how that domestic rebuilding process plays out.
So just on the Belt and Road Initiative, I think the simplest way to respond to the Belt and Road Initiative is to offer better terms, to say, we will help build the infrastructure that you desperately need in a way that you find better long-term. Jim rightly raised these questions about the long-term consequences of BRI. Jennifer raised these issues as well previously. And the US can respond by helping subsidize companies and ensuring that they are, support economic development in a way that is beneficial to the various constituents across the world. And so I think I'm not a critic of the Belt and Road Initiative in the sense that it does provide infrastructure that is desperately needed across the world. And what we should do is to say, we will do it on better terms for your people.
Well, thank you very much for that intervention, Anupam. And I think that we've come to the end of our hour-and-a-half period. I want to thank the panelists, those who are still here, Tom Kellogg, Karen Boland, and Anupam Chander, and also my colleagues who have had to leave because of other commitments, Professor Lawrence Gostin and Professor Jennifer Hillman. I hope that it's been interesting and informative, and we look forward to having many more opportunities to discuss these and other issues in the realm of international law, global trade, and the other topics we've discussed today, when those of you who are coming to Georgetown are actually here in Washington, D.C. And with thanks to Karen Boland for the hard work that the admissions office did in getting those students to Georgetown, we're going to say goodbye for now. And we look forward to meeting those of you who are coming here very soon when the new term begins later in August. Thank you all.